Bodybuilder Lateisha Jandreau had an impressive physique.
Lateisha Jandreau always kept herself toned, very solid.
She had a beautiful home.
It looked like something that would be on the cover of a magazine.
And she had a successful husband.
He had a BMW 5 Series that he just kept in the garage. Made pretty good money.
But then her husband mysteriously disappeared.
Something just didn't seem right.
It's just, gut feeling.
As the search for him intensified, Lateisha's behavior took a bizarre turn.
There was Christmas wrap on the windows.
She had said that she didn't feel like talking about it.
Why are you hiding in the closet? Because I love your clothes.
Or was it because she had something to hide?
A very strong odor of decomposition came out of that.
Moyock, North Carolina, June 30th, 2010. For most of the morning commuters in this quiet suburban community, a half-hour south of Norfolk, Virginia, it was a typical Wednesday morning.
We have a lot of young military families who live there and work at the various bases. We're near Norfolk Naval Station.
But for Safety Inspector Dennis Carter, this Wednesday was different. For the first time ever, his ride, a coworker named Paul Jandreau, was late.
Paul picked me up for almost 2 years, every day. He was very punctual. And that morning when I walked out on the porch, his
started looking around and looking into it some as just a missing person.
At the house, the deputy found Paul's truck parked in the driveway.
She knocked on the door, knocked on windows, just trying to rouse anybody in case he's sick or he had maybe passed out.
There was no answer, so the deputy called Paul's coworkers at BAE Systems.
The deputy said, does he have any family members that we can contact?
Paul's coworkers suggested she try his wife, Lateisha Jandreau, who worked for another defense contractor.
Mrs. Jandreau worked for the Blackwater security firm.
But when the deputy called Blackwater, Lateisha said she hadn't seen her husband that day.
She really didn't know where he might be.
Not only was Lateisha no help, soon after the authorities got in touch with her, the 37-year-old defense contractor would also mysteriously disappear. A North Carolina native, Lateisha Maria Askew grew up about an hour away from Moyock.
She was from a Hosky area, Hertford County area.
Although an excellent high school athlete, Lateisha never went to college, but that didn't appear to hold her back.
Lateisha Jandreau appeared to be a hardworking person.
Various jobs took her to Raleigh, then New York, and finally Virginia, where she took a job at a Norfolk hospital in 1999.
When I first met Lateisha Jandreau, she was working for Children's Hospitals of the King's Daughter as a human resources person.
The former track and field star had also been divorced twice.
Lateisha was the type of woman that would turn most guys' heads. She was physically fit, always kept herself toned, very solid.
And she was always at the gym, which was how she met 42-year-old Paul Jandreau in the summer of 2002. When he met Lateisha, Paul was planning to leave the Navy after more than 20 years of service.
He retired as a command master chief.
To prepare for his retirement, Paul moved just over the North Carolina line to Moyock, a popular place for Navy retirees.
It's near the water, the Currituck Sound. It's a very nice neighborhood, very quiet.
Some people think of it as the Outer Banks. They do have a lot of tourism there, some nice beaches out on one side of it.
And lots of nice homes, like the one Paul built.
He put his blood, sweat, and tears into that home. It was gorgeous. It looked like something that would be on the cover of a magazine.
Only in his 40s, Paul wasn't a typical retiree, however. He parlayed his Navy experience into a new career with a Norfolk defense contractor, BAE Systems.
BAE was responsible for making modifications to Navy vessels.
He was extremely well liked, extremely well trusted, just held in extremely high regard by everyone he knew.
In addition to his new job, Paul worked hard to keep himself in shape, which is how he met Lateisha in the summer of 2002.
Where he met her was at a kickboxing class. that he had signed up to take in his spare time.
Paul immediately noticed the attractive 29-year-old Lateisha.
She was very in shape, very fit, very muscular, and appeared to be a very strong woman.
Stronger than Paul, in fact.
At a kickboxing class, the very first time they sparred, she put a whooping on him. So I hate to say it, but I guess that whooping was love at first sight.
Soon, Lateisha and Paul were workout partners.
He says, I was holding her ankles and she was doing sit-ups, and he says, I saw that six-pack, and he said, I knew I was going to have her one day.
Within weeks, they were dating. Within months, she had moved in. And within a year, on June 28, 2003, they were married. To his friends, Lateisha seemed like an odd match for the outgoing and friendly Paul.
She was very quiet, a little bit standoffish.
When I first met Lateisha, she never really interacted with anybody. I mean, if you want to talk to her, you had to go sit down next to her and talk to her on the couch.
Paul appeared happy, however.
Different strokes for different folks is all I could tell you.
And other than her introverted nature, Lateisha and Paul appeared to be the perfect upper-middle-class couple.
He had a BMW 5 Series that he just kept in the garage. Made pretty good money at BAE.
Lateisha had also moved on to a defense-related job at a private training facility run by Blackwater USA, one of the country's largest military contractors.
Navy, Army, probably Coast Guard went down there to get, hands-on training with weaponry.
She was working in some type of administrative capacity at Blackwater.
Everything seemed to be going well for the Jandreaus. But then a devastating tragedy would put their 3-year-old marriage to the test.
Plenty of other fish out there in the sea, and I'll find one that wants me for me.
Paul may have wanted to move on, but in the days ahead, the authorities would increasingly wonder whether he ever got the chance. Coming up, the authorities search for Paul.
Maybe he's just had enough with his marriage.
And Lateisha begins acting strangely.
There was Christmas wrap on the windows, and it was July.
Norfolk, Virginia, June 30th, 2010. By mid-morning, 50-year-old Paul Jandreau's co-workers were seriously worried. The retired Navy Master Chief had failed to show up for work that morning and was several hours late.
We knew when he was late for work. that something was wrong.
He was the most punctual individual I have ever met in my life.
Paul's coworkers called the sheriff's department in Currituck County, North Carolina, where Paul lived with his wife, 37-year-old Lateisha Jandreau.
It's a very nice neighborhood, very quiet, middle to upscale neighborhood.
And when a female deputy dropped by the house and knocked on the door, Paul didn't answer.
She did this for several minutes, couldn't get a response.
The deputy called Paul's coworkers, who gave her a phone number for Lateisha.
When Lateisha Jandreau was contacted about her husband's failure to show up for work, she appeared unconcerned.
In fact, she told the deputy that her husband had probably gone somewhere with his girlfriend.
She basically just said, I don't know where he is.
She said she hadn't seen him in several days.
And according to Lateisha, that wasn't too unusual.
She claimed that they lived separate lives.
Lateisha said that they were both seeing other people and that he had probably just gone off with his girlfriend.
She also told the officer that their troubled marriage was coming to an end.
They were planning on probably separating.
However, she did agree to leave work and meet the deputy at the house.
Lateisha Jandreau showed up at the house, actually walked through it with the deputy. It was messy, but there was no Paul.
That was enough to satisfy the authorities, but not Paul's coworkers.
From the time that he was reported missing, his coworkers and neighbors all were very concerned and just felt like something had happened to him.
In fact, Paul's colleagues were so worried that they left work early to check out Paul's house for themselves.
We usually got off at 4 o'clock. That day, I actually left at 3, and me and another coworker drove back down to his house.
And when they pulled into the driveway, they were greeted by a strange sight. All the windows had been covered with Christmas paper.
There was Christmas wrap on the windows, and it was July. He wouldn't have had Christmas wrap on his windows.
Dennis Carter and his coworker started pounding on Paul's door. Once again, there was no answer. But as they walked away, Dennis heard a voice calling from the house.
Dennis, is that you? It was Lateisha's who it was, and I said, yes, it's me. And she said, come to the front door.
Lateisha let Dennis and his coworker inside the house, but the lights were all off and the windows covered.
The house was dark, and you couldn't see the hand in front of your face.
Even more disconcerting, Lateisha was covered too, from head to toe.
She had, I'll never forget, a white robe on. She had a white ball cap, and she had the ball cap pulled down to her eyes, and she had the robe pulled over her face. So the only thing you could see was her eyes.
Although unnerved by Lateisha's bizarre behavior, Dennis and his coworker did ask her point blank whether she had seen Paul.
She said, yes, I have. I said, well, where is he? She said, he left with a woman last night at 2 a.m. He took a bag and he hasn't been back since.
She had discovered that he had a new girlfriend and that he was with her somewhere.
Dennis told Lateisha he didn't believe her.
And she said, why wouldn't you believe me? I said, because I just don't. I don't believe you. He would never do nothing like that.
We knew it wasn't a he ran away and joined the circus kind of thing.
According to Dennis Carter, the accusation made Lateisha angry. He says that she stormed off into the back of the house and returned minutes later with a laptop.
She said, here's his personal laptop. She said to open it up, and I'll show you all the dating websites he's on.
She was insinuating that he had girlfriends on the internet.
Between Lateisha's strange behavior, the wrapping paper on the windows, and her accusations about Paul, his coworkers were more convinced than ever that something was horribly wrong. So they left the Jandreau home in a hurry.
And as we walked out, she slammed the door shut.
Dennis didn't go straight home, however. Instead, he and his friend from work talked to several of Paul's neighbors, who agreed that Lateisha's behavior was cause for concern and action.
When Paul was reported missing, the neighborhood came together and began to watch the Jandreau residence. They watched and monitored everything Lateisha Jandreau did during the time period that Paul was missing.
Paul's coworkers helped too. The next day, July 1st, coworker Kyle Cheatwood and another BAE employee drove down to see if there was any sign of Paul.
When we got down there, Paul's truck was backed up to the front door of the house.
There was a lot of furniture in the truck.
But the person loading the truck wasn't Paul. It was Lateisha. After consulting with the neighbors, Kyle contacted the authorities.
The neighbors and the co-workers were all concerned that she was moving furniture out of the house, and that, you know, of course they felt like she was trying to conceal something. So I came to talk to her about the furniture and everything else that was going on.
Lateisha said it was nothing.
She actually said that there was some furniture that Paul and her purchased from a neighbor, and that she was just trying to clean it up because everybody kept saying the house was messy.
She even let the detective look over the truck, albeit reluctantly.
Lateisha seemed very just aggravated, really, that everybody kept questioning her about Paul.
Once again, the authorities found no sign of Paul, no indication of foul play. But they weren't willing to believe that Paul had really run off with a girlfriend without some confirmation.
The first thing we did was call his phone. We called his cell phones. And then we called Verizon, and we tried to track his phone.
The result was evidence that could finally lead them to Paul.
His phone was pinging the towers over here in Elizabeth City.
Investigators immediately drove to Elizabeth City, a town of 20,000, a half-hour south of Moyoc.
They canvassed various hotels thinking maybe he's just had enough with his marriage and he's just left for a couple of days. People do that.
We had a printout of his driver's license picture made so we could come and ask some hotel staff or managers if they had seen Mr. Jandreau.
The canvass quickly produced witnesses whose stories suggested that Lateisha was telling the truth.
Some people thought they may have seen a white man in his 50s who matched that description.
When we got to the Hampton Inn, there were several employees that had recognized Mr. Jandreau from the picture and thought that they had seen him the night before.
However, even as the deputies figured they were close to finding the missing man, Paul's co-workers continued trying to contact him.
5 different people in the shop that were calling him, trying to get a hold of, and nobody could get an answer back.
And that afternoon, more than 24 hours after Paul had gone missing, someone finally answered his phone. But it wasn't Paul.
A construction worker found it and actually answered it.
It was just walking along and found the phone in a parking lot.
Once Paul's co-workers explained the situation, the construction worker agreed to turn the phone over to the authorities.
Myself and Sergeant Matusko met him, got the phone. He took us to where he found the phone.
It was found in a school parking lot.
And the investigators suspected it hadn't been dropped there by accident.
It was in pristine condition. My opinion, it was placed there to be found. It was placed basically right in the middle of the driveway coming in.
Was Paul trying to throw someone off his trail? Or was something else going on? That same day, Lateisha called the investigators.
It was a little peculiar. She wanted to know if I was coming by her house today. I told her I would like to talk with her.
The detective division had set up a time to meet her to discuss Paul's disappearance.
However, when they showed up at the appointed time, she was gone.
There's a note on the door, and it says that she's gone for a walk.
We searched the neighborhood to see if she was walking.
There's some trails in the neighborhood that go off in the woods, kind of nature trails.
But there was no sign of Lateisha.
We did call her cell phone. We did not receive a response.
Not quite 72 hours after her husband had gone missing, it was Lateisha's turn to disappear. Coming up, the authorities launch a manhunt for Lateisha.
We did not find her in the neighborhood.
But will they find someone else first?
They knew something was wrong.
By Friday, July 2nd, 2010, it had been 3 days since 50-year-old Paul Jandreau had failed to show up at the Norfolk, Virginia defense contractor where he worked.
His co-workers, they decided, well, that wasn't like him, and they called the sheriff's office.
And now, less than 72 hours after the missing persons investigation began, Paul's wife, 37-year-old Lateisha Jandreau, had disappeared from the couple's Moyoc, North Carolina home.
She was supposed to meet with us when we got there, and there was a note on the door that said she was out for a walk.
We could not reach her by her cell phone. We did not find her in the neighborhood.
But even as the investigators were frantically trying to find or contact Lateisha, she was on the phone with 911.
Contact 911. What's the address to the emergency?
Well, I'm calling because I was told someone's at my house looking for me and I'm not home.
Over the phone, Lateisha told the authorities that she was more than 20 miles away in Virginia.
She said that she was in Chesapeake.
But what about her note on the door about going for a walk and her appointment to talk to the investigators?
She had said that she didn't feel like talking about it. She had to clear her head, things like that.
Lateisha wouldn't tell the dispatcher exactly where she was, but it didn't really matter. Since she had called 911, the authorities had a way to find out.
The communications center used their technology to track her.
And since the call had come into the Currituck County 911 center, they knew it wasn't Virginia.
When you call into your local communications department, it traces the call. So if you were in Virginia, the call would go to a Virginia communications center.
In fact, Lateisha wasn't just in North Carolina. According to the trace, the call was coming from inside her house.
This alarmed the officers. They knew something was wrong.
She was supposed to be at the house. She was supposed to be waiting on us, and she was going to cooperate with us.
But for some reason, Lateisha had apparently had second thoughts, and the investigators figured they knew why.
There was probably something in the house that she did not want us to find.
We needed to get into that residence. We needed to search that residence.
Sheriff's deputies cordoned off the house to keep Lateisha penned inside until they could get a warrant.
I called the district attorney, went over the case, and felt that there was probable cause that would lead us to discovering the reason for his disappearance.
It was well after dark by the time the sheriff's deputies had secured the warrant and entered the home.
We entered through the garage.
And they noticed immediately there's this big pile of trash in the middle of the garage.
But the deputies kept moving, guns drawn.
We were trying to find Lateisha Jandreau.
Eventually, the investigators found Lateisha. She was in the walk-in closet off the master bedroom, lying motionless on the floor. But while she wasn't moving, she wasn't dead either.
It was almost like playing possum.
I holstered my weapon and I yanked her out of the closet.
The former bodybuilder didn't try to resist.
She wasn't aggressive. There was no muscles flexing. She was hiding her face and had her head down.
Once they had Lateisha in custody, the deputies split up. While some searched the house, others finally sat Lateisha down for the interview she had so desperately tried to avoid.
We took her to a room in the house, set up a video camera, advised her of her rights, and we began an interview with her.
Why are you hiding in the closet? Because I was afraid.
Lateisha claimed that she thought someone had been trying to break into the house. Not that the investigators believed her.
They've announced their presence, they've knocked on the door, they've got blue lights going.
Lateisha also denied knowing where Paul was or why he had disappeared.
We don't know what happened to him. How was at work?
She would reiterate over and over again, I haven't seen my husband in several days. She knew nothing, didn't know where he was.
Pressed by the investigators, Lateisha swore that she hadn't done anything to Paul.
Have you and Paul had any major arguments?
We don't argue, we do our own thing.
In fact, Lateisha told the investigators that if she knew where her husband was, she would tell them.
I'm trying to cooperate, I don't know. I just don't know.
But not long after Lateisha denied knowing where Paul was, one of the deputies searching the house stepped into the room and quietly gave her interrogators news that changed everything. In the garage, hidden under the trash pile they had spotted earlier, the investigators had found a 50-gallon plastic tote.
A very strong odor of decomposition came out of that tote.
And inside, something was wrapped in layers of plastic and fabric.
After 20 years of training and experience, I thought this is probably going to be Paul Jandreau.
They didn't want to disturb evidence. They just cut the top of the plastic enough to look inside, and you could see human hair. They knew that this is a body.
The sheriff's investigators immediately contacted the medical examiner and the North Carolina Bureau of Investigations to confirm that the body was Paul.
A crime scene unit came out from the State Bureau of Investigation, and they processed the scene.
Then, while waiting for the CSIs to arrive, the investigators went back to grilling Lateisha.
We're giving you one more chance to come clean.
We know where he is now.
My son was Tuesday. Look at me. We know where he is. This is it? No, he's not in Elizabeth City. He's a lot closer than that. This is your one opportunity. No, look at me.
And when Lateisha's denials continued, they gave her a final warning.
We're talking about the rest of your life here. Don't throw that away. It was a mistake that you can't take back. I didn't do anything to Paul. What do you think we found? I don't know.
It was clear that Lateisha wasn't going to come clean, so the investigators did.
Paul's body.
Paul's body. Yes, it is.
Even when confronted with what the investigators had, Lateisha's denials continued.
I didn't put him there.
But then, as Lateisha continued to talk, her story began to shift. She still denied killing Paul, but she said she might know who did it.
She eventually admitted that she had solicited people to assault him, to beat him up, because she was angry with him.
We just went up to a couple strangers on the street. I was downtown and guys were selling drugs and just hanging on the corner talking.
But why would a couple of random drug dealers want to beat up Paul?
That's what I said, and he picks up on me at times.
It was a lie, Lateisha admitted.
She told officers that he actually wasn't abusing her, she just was mad at him.
But according to Lateisha, her lie was enough to convince the guys on the corner.
Somebody said, somebody should beat up on him. And I said, well, if you ever want to do it, this is where I live. You need to do the passcode.
She claimed to the officers that perhaps they came and beat her husband up. And maybe that's what happened.
I didn't do anything.
Lateisha, please.
I didn't.
And according to Lateisha, she never dreamed anyone would kill him.
I just wanted someone to beat him up, because I didn't want to. But I didn't really want to kill him.
Lateisha may have denied killing Paul, but while she was being questioned, the deputies searching the house found plenty of evidence to suggest that she had tried to hide the murder.
There's cleaning supplies all over. The place is a complete mess.
We saw pieces of the floor removed. She had glued a rug down over part of the floor.
I could see what appeared to be bloodstains on the tassels of the rug.
And when the investigators pulled up the rug, they found bullet holes in the floor. There were more bullet holes in the bedroom walls.
She was filling them with putty or something.
The cover-up was so elaborate. I've never seen anyone go to this lengths to cover up a crime.
They even found a gun, a .45 automatic.
State Bureau of Investigation's crime scene investigators found the weapon in one of the vehicles outside. In Lateisha's vehicle outside, actually.
The body, the bullet holes, the gun. Altogether, it was more than enough for the investigators to place Lateisha under arrest for murder.
They actually arrested her right on the spot and transported her to the sheriff's station.
Coming up, new evidence turns up the heat on Lateisha.
She says, I'd like to tell my story.
But her confession includes a startling new twist.
He came out with his rifle to me and said, I want you out of my house now.
By July 4th, 2010, Lateisha Jandreau had been in custody for almost 24 hours. The 37-year-old had been arrested the day before after investigators from the Currituck County, North Carolina Sheriff's Department found her husband's dead body hidden inside their home.
He was found in a big 50-gallon tote, and he was covered with several layers of plastic, all kinds of things.
Paul had been reported missing just 4 days earlier by his coworkers. But Lateisha, who admitted that her 7-year marriage was all but over, denied killing her husband. Instead, she said the killers were 2 men she'd asked to beat Paul up.
She was venturing the theory that 2, I guess you would call them good Samaritan thugs, came over to work him over.
The authorities didn't believe a word of it.
There was no evidence to support that theory that I ever saw.
But the investigators had uncovered plenty of evidence to suggest that Lateisha had killed him. When Paul's body was autopsied, the medical examiner recovered several .45 caliber slugs, the same size as the handgun the investigators had found in Lateisha's car.
It was a good case. We had the murder weapon. We had the body found in the home.
In fact, they even had a motive. When they contacted Paul's family to inform them of his death, they told the investigators that Paul had been preparing to file for divorce. And according to the family, Lateisha knew it was coming.
He asked her to leave. He actually had a lawyer draw up paperwork asking her to vacate the premises. He did everything he could to get her to leave.
He had even given her a deadline, June 30th, the day he disappeared.
We felt good with all the evidence that we had collected.
Lateisha, on the other hand, appeared to be having second thoughts. Not long after she was booked into the Currituck County Jail on murder charges, she contacted the investigators and said she wanted to talk.
She says, "I'd like to tell my story."
In her new interview, Lateisha admitted that she had made up the Good Samaritans she had supposedly met on an Elizabeth City street corner. Instead, Lateisha confessed that she was the one who shot Paul.
This time, Lateisha Jandreau changes her story and now says she in fact killed her husband and it was self-defense.
According to Lateisha, it all started when Paul gave her the deadline to get out of the house.
I went to see an attorney, and the attorney told me that I did not have to move out. If he wanted to move out, he could.
But when she told Paul what her attorney had said, she claimed that he had spent the rest of the month trying to scare her into leaving.
Every morning, he knew I was up. He would come in, kick the door, "When are you leaving?"
Lateisha said she had been terrified by Paul's behavior and that she took precautions.
I actually went over to a friend's house and I took their gun.
And it was a good thing, too, according to Lateisha, or she might have been the one who ended up dead. According to Lateisha, on the morning of June 30th, the morning of Paul's deadline to get out of the house, he had stormed into her bedroom as usual. But she claimed that this time he'd added a new twist, a gun.
He came out with his rifle and he pointed at me and said, "I want you out of my house now."
According to Lateisha, he told her she had 5 minutes to leave, and then he turned around and walked out.
She claimed that she was so frightened for her safety that she went and got a handgun she had stolen, came around to his room, and she began shooting into the room.
And I shot at him one time. He backed away. I shot him again. He ran toward me and I shot him. He jumped on me and we struggled.
Lateisha Jandreau claimed that he tried to get the gun from her and they wrestled around for the gun.
I started trying to beat him and get him off of me. And then the gun slipped out of my hand for a minute and I reached up for it while he was on me and I just kept shooting.
When the shooting stopped, Lateisha said she had panicked, spending the next 3 days desperately trying to hide the fact that her husband was dead.
When the deputy showed up, where was he at? The deputy arrived.
In the closet.
When the coworker showed up, where was he?
In the closet.
That was Lateisha's new story. However, the authorities didn't believe it any more than they had the last one.
Lateisha Jandreau was charged with first-degree murder.
And when the case went to trial in September 2012, the prosecution argued that Paul's death was anything but self-defense.
We believe that she ambushed him.
The reason, according to the prosecution's opening statement, was that Lateisha didn't want to give up the lifestyle she had enjoyed since marrying Paul.
Paul was very successful. He was a retired master chief, had a great job at BAE, and very nice house, an outdoor pool.
The prosecutors theorized that Lateisha had started laying plans to protect that lifestyle as soon as Paul announced that he intended to file for divorce.
She had stolen a gun from a friend of hers several days before this, which we believe showed premeditation.
And on the morning of Paul's deadline for Lateisha to leave the house, while Paul got dressed for work, she struck.
She came in shooting and took him by surprise.
Shots were fired. There was a struggle over the gun.
She was a powerful woman. She's a bodybuilder. She overpowered him. She shot him several times and hit him in the head.
She wasn't going to let him out of the house alive.
Besides, if it was self-defense as Lateisha claimed, why not call the police?
If you'd gotten into a domestic disturbance and you felt you had to take someone's life for your own safety, why would you try to hide the body?
Her first impulse was not to call 911, not to render any type of aid. She put a plastic bag over his head to keep blood off the floor. Then she drug him out of the room and began to wrap him.
And prosecutors told the jury it was more than 24 hours later that Lateisha went out for more supplies.
She actually went to various home improvement stores. She went and got a bigger plastic tote because the one that she already had, he didn't fit in comfortably. So she actually went and got a bigger tote. We had her on tape buying it.
And even as investigators had begun asking questions about Paul's disappearance, prosecutors said Lateisha was attempting to cover up the evidence of his murder.
She actually caulked the bullet holes on the wall. She put caulking in it to cover up the holes. She's cutting up carpet, presumably to replace. She is cleaning everything in sight.
That wasn't all she had done either. Since her arrest, the investigators uncovered evidence that Lateisha had rented a storage unit the day after Paul disappeared.
We believe that she planned to move the body, but did not anticipate the sheer volume of people that would begin to watch her, because once Paul went missing, the neighborhood turned all eyes on this house.
When it was their turn, the defense stood by the final story that Lateisha had told the authorities.
They claimed that Paul Jandreau came into that room that morning with a gun and threatened to kill her, and she was fearful of her safety and tried to defend herself. That was their story, and that was what they presented at trial.
It's just the biggest lie I've ever heard in my life. Knowing Paul, who he was, what he was about, his morals, his ethics, never in a million years would I believe that it was self-defense.
But in the end, the opinions of Paul's friends and coworkers didn't matter. It all came down to the 12 people on the jury. Coming up, Lateisha awaits her fate.
Is this defendant going to generate some sympathy?
As the jury makes its decision.
An hour and 40 minutes. That's not long for a verdict.
On September 28, 2012, family, friends, and co-workers of Paul Jandreau packed a Currituck County, North Carolina courtroom, awaiting the jury's verdict in the murder trial of Lateisha Jandreau. The 39-year-old bodybuilder and defense contractor had been arrested in July of 2010 after the authorities found Paul's body hidden in the couple's Moyock, North Carolina home.
We felt it was a very strong case. We have her taking elaborate steps to cover up this crime. She didn't report her husband missing.
We all had no doubt that Lateisha had done it.
But would the jury agree? At trial, Lateisha's attorneys had argued that she had shot Paul in self-defense.
We always worry what a jury will do with a case. You never know. No matter how strong a case is this defendant going to generate some sympathy?
She had claimed that Paul had attacked her and been abusive to her.
One way or another, the friends and family crowding the courtroom wouldn't have long to wait.
The jury took about an hour and 40 minutes. That's not long for a verdict.
And when the verdict was read, the jury found Lateisha guilty of first-degree murder.
When that verdict was read, I think there was some crying. The family was just very emotional.
Lateisha, on the other hand, reacted with stony silence.
There was no regret, no remorse, no emotion, nothing. Looking into her eyes is like looking into darkness. She showed nothing whatsoever.
The judge sentenced her to life without the possibility of parole.
I was relieved. I felt justice was served.
Although the man who first realized Paul was missing, his coworker Dennis Carter, disagrees. In his mind, no amount of jail time can make up for the life of his friend.
I don't believe is enough for what she did, because he's not here and she still is. Regardless whether she spends the rest of her life in a small cell without the chance of parole, she's still here and he's not.
Eastbourne, on the southern coast of England, was the kind of town people imagined when they thought about safety. Quiet streets curved toward the sea. Elderly couples walked along the promenade beneath cold, gray skies. Gardens were carefully trimmed. Curtains twitched gently in expensive homes built for retirement, comfort, and privacy. In the years after the Second World War, Eastbourne became known as a refuge for the wealthy and aging. A peaceful place where people came to spend the final chapters of their lives surrounded by calm, routine, and respectability. And in that town, among those respectable streets and carefully maintained homes, one man became more trusted than almost anyone else. His name was John Bodkin Adams. To many people, Dr. Adams represented stability itself. He was polite, soft-spoken, deeply religious, and always impeccably dressed. He made house calls. He sat beside the beds of elderly patients for hours. He comforted families. He reassured frightened widows. He seemed patient in a way many doctors were not. At a time when medicine still carried an almost sacred authority, Adams became exactly the kind of physician people believed they could trust with their lives. And perhaps more importantly, with their deaths. For years, no one openly questioned him. Why would they? He worked tirelessly among the sick and elderly. Many of his patients were women living alone after losing husbands during war, illness, or old age. Some had no close relatives nearby. Others were wealthy enough to require servants, but emotionally isolated enough to depend entirely on the quiet reassurance of their doctor. Adams entered their homes as a caregiver, but often became something more: advisor, confidant, witness to private fears, the man who controlled pain, the man who decided which medicines were necessary, the man who stayed in the room when everyone else had left. And slowly, over time, strange patterns began to form around him. Patterns that were almost invisible at first. One death, then another. Elderly patients slipping into unconsciousness shortly before dying. Heavy doses of morphine. Strong sedatives. Quiet funerals. Rapid cremations. Then came the wills. Money left behind. Antiques. Valuable possessions. Cars. Inheritance gifts unexpectedly directed toward Dr. Adams himself. It happened again and again and again. By the mid-1950s, whispers had already begun moving through Eastbourne social circles. They traveled quietly between neighbors, nurses, servants, and relatives. Never loudly, never publicly. Accusing a respected physician was almost unthinkable. But still the rumors spread. People noticed how often wealthy patients died under Adams' care. They noticed how frequently he appeared in their wills afterward. And eventually, a sentence began circulating through the town, part warning, part dark joke, part genuine fear. If you're rich and sick in Eastbourne, don't call Dr. Adams. It was the kind of statement people repeated carefully, often in lowered voices. Because despite the rumors, Adams remained powerful. Doctors in Britain during the 1940s and 1950s occupied an extraordinary position in society. Their decisions were rarely challenged. Medical knowledge was inaccessible to ordinary people. Patients obeyed instructions without question. Families trusted physicians to determine what treatment was necessary, especially when death approached. And death was everywhere in Adams' world. Between 1946 and 1956, according to later investigations, at least 163 of his patients died in circumstances that attracted suspicion. Many had received unusually large quantities of morphine, heroin-based medications, barbiturates, or sedatives shortly before death. Some became unconscious after injections. Others drifted into states described by nurses as delirious or heavily drugged. More than 130 patients reportedly left gifts or money to Adams in their wills. To investigators, it eventually became impossible to ignore the sheer scale of those numbers. But statistics alone do not create fear. What frightened people was something harder to measure: the unsettling possibility that a doctor could hide violence behind compassion. That murder, if committed carefully enough, might look almost identical to medical care, especially in elderly patients already close to death, especially in an era with limited forensic science, especially when the person administering the drugs was the same man trusted to certify the cause of death afterward. That possibility transformed the Adams case from an ordinary criminal investigation into something much darker. Because if the suspicions were true, then Adams had discovered one of the safest places imaginable for a killer to operate: inside the private rooms of dying people, behind closed curtains, under the protection of medicine itself. The allegations against him were horrifying not because of brutality in the traditional sense, but because of their quietness. There were no public attacks, no visible bloodshed, no dramatic crime scenes. The deaths happened slowly, often in bed, often in silence, while patients were too weak or sedated to understand what was happening around them. The suspected murder weapon was not a knife or gun, but trust. Trust placed in a doctor who appeared compassionate while allegedly controlling every aspect of a patient's final days: medication, access to relatives, emotional dependence, even legal documents connected to inheritance. Some nurses later described deeply troubling moments: patients receiving injections shortly before sudden deterioration, heavy sedation that seemed excessive, strange medical decisions that were difficult to challenge because Adams was senior, respected, and confident. But nurses occupied a difficult position in that era. Questioning a doctor publicly could destroy careers. Medicine operated through rigid hierarchy, and Adams understood that hierarchy well. He also understood something else: dying patients rarely received close scrutiny from police. Elderly deaths were expected. Morphine use in terminal care was common, and cremation could eliminate evidence permanently. Yet even years later, one question continued haunting investigators: how many deaths around Adams were natural, and how many were not? That uncertainty became the center of the entire case. There is no single dramatic murder scene investigators could point toward. Instead, there was accumulation, repetition, patterns emerging across years: wealthy women, sedatives, inheritances, rapid decline after treatment. The same doctor appearing over and over again at the center of death. As suspicion grew, Scotland Yard eventually launched one of the most extraordinary investigations in British criminal history. Detectives began reviewing medical records, wills, prescriptions, and death certificates. What they uncovered shocked even experienced investigators: missing drugs, altered records, incorrect paperwork, cremation forms raising serious concerns. And somewhere inside that growing mountain of evidence stood Dr. John Bodkin Adams himself, calm, controlled, outwardly unshaken. During the investigation, One exchange would become infamous across Britain. An investigator directly asked Adams whether he had intentionally killed patients. Adams reportedly replied, "I don't think you can prove it was murder. It was not a confession. It was something colder." A statement that seemed to acknowledge the terrifying complexity of the case itself. Because proving murder in a medical setting is extraordinarily difficult. Pain medication can resemble poison. Compassion can resemble manipulation. End-of-life care can resemble calculated killing. And when a respected doctor controls both treatment and documentation, certainty becomes elusive. That single sentence sent shockwaves through Britain. Newspapers seized upon it immediately. Public fascination exploded. Was Adams arrogantly mocking investigators? Was he simply pointing out the weakness of the evidence? Or was he revealing an uncomfortable truth about medicine itself? That doctors possess enormous power over life and death, often beyond the understanding of ordinary people. Soon the investigation became national news. Reporters flooded Eastbourne. Headlines questioned whether Britain was facing the revelation of a hidden serial killer operating within the medical profession. Some defended Adams passionately, insisting he was a dedicated physician unfairly targeted for helping terminally ill patients. Others became convinced they were witnessing one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in reverse. Not the conviction of an innocent man, but the possible escape of a guilty one. And beneath all the sensational headlines remained the dead. Elderly women whose final days were clouded by sedation, confusion, and dependence. Patients who may have trusted their doctor completely. Some of them left behind families who later wondered whether natural death had arrived on its own or been hurried forward by the very man entrusted to ease suffering. The case forced Britain to confront deeply uncomfortable questions. How much power should doctors possess over dying patients? At what point does pain relief become something more dangerous? Can compassion and greed exist inside the same person? And perhaps most disturbingly of all, if a doctor truly wanted to kill, how would anyone ever prove it? Because unlike most murder investigations, the John Bodkin Adams case was built not around certainty, but around shadows. Around doubts that refused to disappear. Around suspicions too large to ignore, yet too difficult to fully prove. In many ways, that uncertainty is precisely why the case still endures decades later. Some investigators came to believe Adams was one of the most prolific serial killers in British history. Others insisted he was simply a physician practicing aggressive pain management during an era with different medical standards. The line between mercy and murder became dangerously blurred. And standing directly on that line was Dr. John Bodkin Adams, the trusted doctor of Eastbourne, the man who comforted the dying, inherited from the dead, and walked into one of the most controversial murder trials Britain had ever seen. To understand how John Bodkin Adams became one of the most controversial figures in British criminal history, it is necessary to understand the world he lived in and the people who placed their trust in him. Eastbourne, during the middle of the 20th century, was not simply a town. It was a carefully preserved image of post-war English respectability. Located along England's southern coast, it attracted wealthy retirees, widows, and aging members of the upper and middle classes who came searching for peace after lifetimes shaped by war, loss, and social change. The sea air was considered healthy. The streets were orderly. Life moved slowly there. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's routines, where servants still worked quietly inside expensive homes, and where doctors occupied an almost untouchable social position. In towns like Eastbourne, physicians were more than medical professionals. They were authority figures woven deeply into the emotional lives of families. People invited them into bedrooms, private conversations, and moments of despair. Doctors saw patients at their weakest, frightened, aging, grieving, dependent. Most importantly, they were trusted absolutely. That trust created the perfect environment for someone like John Bodkin Adams to thrive. Adams was born in Ireland in 1899. By the 1920s, he had moved to England and begun building his medical career. Nothing in his early public image suggested scandal or violence. On the contrary, he appeared disciplined, intelligent, and deeply devoted to his profession. He cultivated the image of a respectable country doctor carefully and successfully. Patients saw a man who spoke softly, dressed neatly, and carried himself with calm assurance. He was known for making house calls personally rather than rushing patients through brief appointments. He spent time with the elderly. He listened. He projected patience. In many ways, Adams understood something essential about medicine that extended beyond prescriptions or diagnoses. Illness creates loneliness, especially among the elderly. Many of the women who eventually became central figures in the investigation were living through isolation long before Adams entered their lives. Some were widows who had lost husbands years earlier. Others had strained relationships with relatives or no close family nearby. Several were wealthy enough to live comfortably, but emotionally vulnerable enough to depend heavily on the people around them. Adams became extraordinarily skilled at stepping into that emotional space. He was not simply a doctor treating symptoms. He became part of the rhythm of patients' daily lives. He visited homes repeatedly. He reassured anxious women terrified of illness and death. He positioned himself as someone reliable in moments when age and declining health made people feel powerless. And slowly, almost invisibly, professional relationships sometimes blurred into something more personal. Investigators later became deeply disturbed by how often Adams inserted himself into the financial affairs of patients. Over time, more than 130 patients reportedly left him gifts, money, or valuables in their wills. These were not symbolic gestures. Some inheritances included antiques, cash, furniture, and even luxury vehicles. In another profession, such a pattern would have immediately triggered alarm. But in the social climate of the 1940s and 1950s, especially within wealthy circles, doctors receiving gifts from grateful patients was not unheard of. That ambiguity became one of the central problems in the Adams case. At what point does gratitude become exploitation? When does emotional dependence cross into manipulation? Those questions haunted investigators because Adams never appeared outwardly aggressive or threatening. There are no scenes of obvious coercion. Instead, there was influence subtle, difficult to measure, and possibly hidden beneath the ordinary intimacy of medical care. Among all the women associated with Adams, one name would eventually become inseparable from the investigation itself: Edith Alice Morrell. Morrell was wealthy, elderly, and physically vulnerable after suffering a stroke that left her bedridden. By the time Adams became deeply involved in her care, she depended heavily on those around her. In cases involving severely ill patients, the line between treatment and control can become dangerously thin. The doctor determines medication. The doctor determines dosage. The doctor decides which symptoms require intervention and which are expected consequences of illness. For patients unable to move freely or advocate for themselves, that power becomes immense. According to later testimony, Adams administered extremely large quantities of morphine and heroin-based medication to Morrell over an extended period. Nurses caring for her described troubling patterns. After injections, Morrell reportedly drifted into states of confusion and unconsciousness. She became heavily sedated. At times she appeared disconnected from reality itself. To modern observers, such accounts sound deeply alarming. But at the time, strong pain medication for severely ill patients existed in a far less regulated medical environment. Nurses might privately question a doctor's judgment, yet openly challenging him could be professionally dangerous. This is one of the most unsettling aspects of the Adams case. Many people around him may have sensed something was wrong long before authorities acted, but social structures prevented meaningful confrontation. Doctors held authority. Nurses obeyed. Families deferred to medical expertise they often did not understand. And patients themselves were frequently too weak or medicated to describe what they were experiencing clearly. When Edith Alice Morrell died in 1950, Adams inherited valuable possessions from her estate, including antiques and even a Rolls-Royce. That fact alone did not prove murder, but intensified growing unease surrounding him. The image became difficult to ignore, a doctor repeatedly present at the deaths of wealthy women, then appearing in their wills afterward. Yet even then, suspicion remained fragmented. No single event forced immediate intervention. Instead, concern accumulated slowly, almost quietly, as though Eastbourne itself struggled to accept what the pattern might mean. Another woman whose death would later attract intense scrutiny was Gertrude Hullett. Unlike Morrell, Hullett was not terminally ill. She reportedly suffered from depression, but investigators later emphasized that she was not believed to be dying. Adams treated her using sedatives and barbiturates, drugs capable of heavily suppressing the body, when administered in large amounts. Eventually, Hullett died with extremely high levels of medication in her system. For investigators, this case appeared especially troubling because of Adams' actions afterward. According to allegations raised during the investigation, Adams attempted to discourage a post-mortem examination and pushed for rapid cremation. In retrospect, those details became deeply significant. Cremation destroys forensic evidence permanently. If investigators later wished to determine precise causes of death, opportunities vanished once a body was cremated. To detectives examining the broader pattern surrounding Adams, such behavior appeared suspicious. Yet again, ambiguity complicated everything. Doctors frequently handled funeral arrangements and paperwork in that era. A physician advocating cremation was not automatically evidence of criminal intent. The Adams investigation repeatedly collided with this same problem. Nearly every suspicious action could potentially be interpreted in two completely different ways: compassion or concealment, medical judgment or manipulation, administrative routine or destruction of evidence. The uncertainty made the case extraordinarily difficult to untangle. Then there was Clara Neal Miller, another wealthy patient whose death contributed to growing suspicion. One nurse later described encountering Adams alone with Miller while the patient was under heavy sedation. The image is unsettling precisely because so little certainty exists around it. A doctor standing beside a sedated patient is not inherently criminal. Yet within the broader pattern, investigators believed they were uncovering. Moments like these took on darker implications. After Miller's death, Adams reportedly inherited more than £1, 200, and became the sole executor of her will. There were also claims that he searched through her belongings shortly after she died. Again, none of these facts individually proved murder. But together, they painted a portrait of a physician deeply entangled in the personal and financial lives of dying patients. As stories accumulated, Eastbourne itself became psychologically divided. Publicly, Adams remained respected. Patients continued seeking his care. Social status protected him. Yet privately, rumors spread more aggressively. People began discussing how frequently death seemed to follow his visits. Some families reportedly felt uneasy about how isolated loved ones became under Adams' care. Nurses whispered among themselves about unusual drug administration. But suspicion in itself is not evidence. In Britain during the 1950s was still a society built heavily around deference to professional authority. To accuse a doctor of murder, especially a successful and respected one, required crossing a social boundary many people found unimaginable. This atmosphere of hesitation allowed uncertainty to flourish. Adams continued practicing medicine while rumors deepened around him. And perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case was how ordinary everything appeared from the outside. There were no dramatic public confrontations, no obvious violence, no clear moment when the town collectively realized something terrible might be happening. Instead, there was a gradual accumulation of discomfort hidden beneath polite society. Elderly women became ill. Doctors prescribed medication. Patients died. Funerals were held. Estates were settled. Life in Eastbourne continued. Yet beneath that calm surface, patterns continued emerging. Wealthy female patients, heavy sedation, increasing dependence on Adams, valuable inheritances, death, again and again. Looking back decades later, historians and criminologists would argue fiercely over what those patterns truly meant. Some came to believe Adams exploited vulnerable women who trusted him completely. Others insisted the suspicions reflected misunderstanding of medical practices surrounding pain. Management during the era. Even now, the same uncomfortable question remains unresolved. Were these women victims of a calculating killer? Or were they simply elderly patients receiving aggressive end-of-life treatment from a doctor whose methods appeared disturbing through modern eyes? What makes the case so enduring is that both possibilities seem frighteningly plausible. And at the center of that uncertainty stood the women themselves, aging, isolated, medicated, and dependent on a man whose calm bedside manner concealed motives nobody could fully see. By the early 1950s, death had become an ordinary part of Dr. John Bodkin Adams' professional life. That fact alone was not unusual. Eastbourne was filled with elderly residents, many already in declining health. Doctors in towns like Eastbourne spent much of their careers moving quietly from one sickbed to another, managing pain, comforting families, and witnessing the final days of aging patients. But around Adams, according to later investigators, something felt increasingly wrong. Not because patients died, but because of how they died, and what seemed to happen in the final days before death arrived. The allegations that eventually surrounded Adams did not describe sudden acts of violence. There were no dramatic confrontations, no forced entries, no obvious physical injuries. Instead, investigators believed Adams may have developed a method hidden within the ordinary routines of medical care itself. A method based not on physical force, but on control. Control over medication. Control over frightened patients. Control over access to information. And, perhaps most importantly, control over the thin and ambiguous boundary between easing suffering and causing death. Investigators later believed Adams followed a pattern so subtle that it remained almost invisible. For years, the pattern often began with dependency. Many of his patients were elderly women living alone, emotionally isolated, physically weakened, or deeply anxious about illness. Adams positioned himself at the center of their lives gradually. He visited often. He reassured them. He became indispensable. In an era before modern home healthcare systems, doctors held extraordinary authority inside private homes. Families deferred to them automatically. Servants obeyed instructions without question. Nurses followed orders even when they privately felt uneasy. Once Adams established himself as the primary figure overseeing a patient's care, he gained near total influence over treatment decisions. Investigators later suspected that isolation played an important role in this process. According to allegations raised during the case, Adams often became the dominant authority around dying patients. Family members sometimes found themselves pushed to the edges of decision-making while Adams controlled medication schedules, treatment plans, and medical explanations. In many situations, relatives lacked the knowledge necessary to challenge him. If a patient became heavily sedated or confused, families were likely to assume illness itself was responsible. That assumption gave Adams enormous freedom. Then came the medication. Again and again, investigators found reports involving morphine, heroin-based drugs, barbiturates, and powerful sedatives. These substances were medically legitimate and commonly used during the period, particularly for severe pain management. But witnesses later described situations where dosages appeared unusually large or where patients deteriorated rapidly after receiving injections administered by Adams. One of the most haunting aspects of the case is how ordinary these scenes must have appeared at the time. Imagine a dimly lit bedroom in Eastbourne during winter, curtains drawn against the sea wind, an elderly woman lying weakly in bed, a doctor arriving with black medical bag in hand, a quiet injection administered beside concerned relatives who trusted completely that the man standing before them knew exactly what he was doing. There would have been no dramatic signs, no visible struggle, often just increasing drowsiness, confusion, silence, then unconsciousness, then death. To investigators reviewing these cases years later, the repetition became difficult to ignore. Nurses who cared for some patients described troubling patterns. Several reportedly observed Adams administering injections that were not fully explained or that appeared inconsistent with expected treatment. Others described patients slipping into states of heavy sedation shortly before dying. Some patients reportedly became delirious after receiving medication. Yet even when nurses felt concerned privately, confronting Adams directly was extraordinarily difficult. Medical culture during the 1940s and 1950s was rigidly hierarchical. Doctors occupied unquestioned positions of authority. Nurses challenging senior physicians risked humiliation, professional consequences, or dismissal. That imbalance of power may explain why suspicions surrounding Adams remained fragmented for so long. Individuals noticed pieces of the pattern, but few felt capable of confronting the entire picture openly. Edith Alice Morell's case would later become central to the murder trial. But during her treatment, the situation unfolded gradually over months. Morell had suffered a stroke and was confined to bed, making her heavily dependent on others for care. Adams oversaw her treatment closely. According to later testimony, he administered large quantities of morphine and heroin-based medications over extended periods. Nurses reportedly watched Morell drift repeatedly into states of confusion and unconsciousness following injections. What makes her case particularly disturbing is the psychological vulnerability inherent in prolonged illness. Patients confined to bed often lose control over nearly every aspect of life: movement, privacy, independence, even clarity of thought. They become dependent on caretakers not only physically, but emotionally. If Adams was indeed acting maliciously, investigators believe that dependency would have made resistance almost impossible. Yet the ambiguity surrounding medical treatment complicated everything. Morphine was a legitimate pain medication. Severely ill patients often required strong sedatives. Distinguishing aggressive pain management from intentional poisoning became one of the greatest challenges in the entire case. Every suspicious medical decision could potentially be explained as compassionate care, and Adams understood that reality well. Another deeply troubling case involved Gertrude Hullett. Unlike Morell, Hullett was reportedly not terminally ill. She suffered from depression, but investigators later questioned whether her condition justified the powerful sedatives and barbiturates she received. Eventually, she died with extremely high levels of medication in her system. Investigators would later view this as one of the strongest potential cases against Adams because the medical justification for such heavy sedation appeared less clear. But what alarmed detectives even more were Adams' actions after her death. According to later allegations, Adams attempted to discourage a post-mortem examination and strongly encouraged rapid cremation. To understand why investigators considered this significant, it is important to remember the limitations of forensic science during the era. Once cremation occurred, many opportunities for later toxicological analysis disappeared permanently. If suspicious medication had contributed to death, much of the evidence could vanish forever. Detectives eventually began seeing a recurring pattern in which potentially important forensic evidence no longer existed because bodies had already been cremated. That realization transformed earlier uncertainty into growing suspicion. Then there was Clara Neal Miller. A nurse later described seeing Adams alone with Miller while the patient was heavily sedated. Again, the scene itself was not inherently criminal. Doctors routinely treated sedated patients privately. But within the larger pattern investigators believed they were uncovering, moments like these acquired sinister implications. After Miller's death, Adams inherited money and reportedly became sole executor of her will. There were also allegations that he searched through her belongings after she died. Investigators eventually began asking a terrifying question. Had Adams discovered that death itself could become financially profitable? The issue of inheritance became impossible to separate from the allegations against him. More than 130 patients reportedly left Adams gifts or money. Some gave him expensive possessions. Others included him prominently in wills. Critics argued that the sheer frequency of these inheritances suggested manipulation. Supporters countered that wealthy elderly patients often became emotionally attached to devoted physicians, especially those who spent years caring for them compassionately. That debate became central to the mystery surrounding Adams. Was he exploiting vulnerable women emotionally and medically? Or was he simply a trusted physician whose grateful patients rewarded him generously? What made the situation even more unsettling was how invisible the alleged crimes would have been to outsiders. Most deaths occur behind closed bedroom doors. Elderly patients often appeared medically fragile already. Sedation could easily resemble natural decline. Families grieving loved ones were unlikely to immediately suspect murder, particularly when reassured by a respected physician. If Adams truly was killing patients intentionally, investigators believed he may have exploited one of the safest possible environments for undetected murder: end-of-life medical care. Yet despite growing rumors, Adams remained socially protected for years. Wealth and status surrounded him. Eastbourne's culture emphasized politeness and restraint. Public accusations against prominent professionals were rare. Even individuals who privately suspected wrongdoing often hesitated to involve police because their concerns remained based more on patterns and intuition than direct evidence. This atmosphere allowed suspicion to spread slowly through whispers rather than formal complaints. Nurses talked quietly among themselves. Servants noticed unusual behavior. Relatives felt vague discomfort they struggled to articulate clearly. And through it all, Adams continued moving from house to house, patient to patient, maintaining the outward image of a devoted physician. The psychological tension surrounding the case grew precisely because certainty remained elusive. No one could fully prove what was happening. Many of the women under Adams' care were genuinely ill. Some were already near death. Strong pain medication was medically accepted. The same evidence that appeared deeply suspicious to some observers could appear entirely reasonable to others. This ambiguity would later become the defining feature of the case. Because murder within a medical setting rarely resembles conventional violence, it hides behind technical language, professional authority, and the complex reality of human suffering. The Adams case forced investigators to confront the terrifying possibility that medicine itself could provide cover for homicide. A doctor possesses legal access to dangerous drugs. A A doctor determines dosage levels. A doctor can interpret symptoms, certify causes of death, and influence whether further examination occurs. In many ways, the profession offered precisely the tools necessary for undetectable killing, especially during an era with limited oversight and weaker forensic science. Yet despite mounting suspicion, authorities still lacked something crucial. A definitive moment capable of transforming rumor into formal investigation. That moment finally began emerging in 1956, when allegations against Adams could no longer remain hidden beneath Eastbourne's quiet surface. By then, years of deaths, whispers, inheritances, and uneasy observations had accumulated into something too large to dismiss as coincidence alone. Scotland Yard would soon enter Eastbourne, and the carefully controlled world Adams had built around himself would begin to collapse under national scrutiny. By 1956, the rumors surrounding Dr. John Bodkin Adams had existed for years, drifting quietly through Eastbourne like fog rolling in from the English Channel. They lived in half-finished conversations, nervous glances between nurses, and the uneasy instincts of relatives who could never fully explain why certain deaths troubled them more than others. But rumors alone are fragile things. They fade easily when placed against wealth, status, and professional respectability. For a long time, Adams remained protected by precisely those forces. He was not an outsider. He was Eastbourne's trusted physician, a man deeply embedded within the town's social structure. Challenging him meant challenging the authority of medicine itself. Yet eventually, the number of suspicious deaths, unusual inheritances, and disturbing stories surrounding him became too large to ignore completely. The turning point came in 1956, when police reportedly received an anonymous call accusing Adams of killing patients in order to inherit from them. The accusation itself was explosive. Britain had seen murder cases before, but allegations against a respected doctor carried a uniquely terrifying implication. Doctors were entrusted with life-and-death decisions every day. If a physician was abusing that trust intentionally, then ordinary patients possessed almost no protection against it. The anonymous complaint transformed scattered suspicion into something official. Scotland Yard became involved, launching one of the most unusual investigations in British criminal history. Detectives entering Eastbourne faced an extraordinary challenge from the very beginning. They were not investigating a conventional murder scene. There was no body discovered in an alleyway, no weapon abandoned after a violent attack, no eyewitness describing a sudden act of brutality. Instead, investigators confronted years of medical records, death certificates, prescriptions, cremation documents, and whispered recollections from nurses and relatives trying to reconstruct events that had unfolded slowly behind closed doors. Many of the suspected victims had already been dead for years. Some had been cremated. Others had died under circumstances that initially appeared medically ordinary. Detectives quickly realized they were not investigating one suspicious death. They were potentially investigating dozens, perhaps more. The scale of the inquiry itself became deeply unsettling. Investigators began reviewing Adams' patient histories carefully. Certain patterns immediately stood out. Large numbers of elderly women, frequent use of morphine, heroin-based medication, barbiturates, and sedatives. Patients slipping into unconsciousness shortly before death. Substantial gifts and inheritances directed toward Adams and wills. Even seasoned detectives reportedly found the accumulation disturbing. One suspicious death can be coincidence. Two might still be explainable. But repeated patterns across years begin to create a different kind of psychological weight. Detectives were no longer examining isolated incidents. They were trying to determine whether an entire hidden system of murder had existed inside a respected medical practice. The investigation soon widened dramatically. Scotland Yard officers examined financial records, prescription histories, death certificates, and cremation paperwork connected to Adams' patients. What they reportedly uncovered intensified suspicion further. According to investigators, there were missing drugs that could not be properly accounted for. Medical documentation appeared altered in certain instances. Some death certificates allegedly contained inaccurate information. Each discovery on its own might not have been devastating, but together, they created the impression of disorder or possibly concealment surrounding Adams' professional records. Detectives also faced a profound forensic problem almost immediately. Many of the bodies central to the investigation no longer existed in a form that could be examined effectively. Cremation had erased potential evidence permanently. In modern murder investigations, forensic toxicology often plays a central role in determining whether drugs contributed to death. But once a body has been cremated, those opportunities vanish. This reality haunted investigators throughout the Adams inquiry. Again and again, detectives found themselves examining deaths where definitive scientific proof was no longer possible. That absence of certainty would eventually become one of the greatest obstacles to prosecution. The investigation increasingly focused on several key women whose deaths appeared especially troubling. Among them was Gertrude Hullett. Detectives reportedly believed her case may have offered the strongest possibility of proving criminal wrongdoing because she was not believed to be terminally ill before her death. Hullett had reportedly suffered from depression, but investigators questioned the necessity of the extremely powerful sedatives and barbiturates involved in her treatment. The circumstances following her death disturbed detectives even more. Adams had allegedly discouraged post-mortem examination and encouraged rapid cremation. To investigators trying to determine whether poisoning or overmedication occurred, these actions appeared highly suspicious. In many ways, the Hullett case represented the central fear surrounding Adams. If a doctor possessed the ability to administer dangerous medication while simultaneously influencing whether forensic examination occurred afterward, then proving intentional murder became extraordinarily difficult. Yet despite investigators reportedly viewing Hullett as a strong potential case, prosecutors ultimately made a controversial strategic decision. Rather than focusing first on Hullett, they chose to pursue charges connected to Edith Alice Morell instead. This decision would later attract heavy criticism. Morell had indeed received large quantities of morphine and heroin-based medication while under Adams' care, and Adams had inherited valuable items from her estate. But she had also been seriously ill following a stroke. That created room for the defense to argue that strong medication represented legitimate pain management rather than murder. Critics later argued that prosecutors selected the wrong victim because the Morell case contained too much medical ambiguity. But during the investigation itself, authorities were operating under enormous pressure. Public interest was exploding. Newspapers across Britain seized upon every development. Headlines increasingly portrayed the investigation as a national scandal involving a possible Dr. Killer. Eastbourne transformed almost overnight from quiet retirement town into the center of one of Britain's most sensational criminal inquiries. Journalists crowded the streets. Reporters pursued nurses, relatives, and investigators. The public became obsessed with the possibility that a respected physician might secretly be a serial murderer. Yet public opinion divided sharply. Many people believed Adams was obviously guilty. The inheritance patterns alone seemed impossible to explain innocently. Others defended him passionately, insisting he was a compassionate doctor being persecuted for aggressively treating pain in dying patients. This division reflected a deeper social anxiety beneath the case itself. People wanted to trust doctors. The idea that a physician could intentionally exploit elderly patients for financial gain threatened something fundamental about post-war British society. Hospitals, family doctors, and medical authority formed part of the social fabric. If Adams truly was a killer, then the crime extended beyond individual deaths. It represented a betrayal of trust at the center of medicine itself. Investigators interviewing witnesses encountered the same tension repeatedly. Nurses described unusual injections and heavy sedation, but many remained cautious in their wording. Some had clearly felt uneasy for years, but struggled to articulate exactly why. Others worried about accusing a doctor without definitive proof. Relatives recalled discomfort surrounding Adams' closeness to patients' finances or wills. Yet uncertainty lingered over every statement. Detectives increasingly understood that this case would likely never produce the kind of absolute clarity seen in ordinary murder investigations. Medicine itself complicated everything. Morphine can relieve suffering. It can also suppress breathing. Sedatives can comfort dying patients. They can also accelerate death if administered improperly. Intent became almost impossible to prove directly. Was Adams easing pain compassionately? Was he recklessly over-medicating vulnerable patients? Or was he deliberately killing? Each possibility fit portions of the evidence. One moment during the investigation became infamous throughout Britain. According to reports, an investigator directly confronted Adams and asked whether he had intentionally killed patients. Adams allegedly responded with chilling calm, "I don't think you can prove it was murder." The statement immediately captured public attention because it sounded deeply unsettling regardless of interpretation. Some people heard arrogance in the words, as though Adams believed himself intellectually untouchable. Others interpreted the statement differently, as a cold acknowledgement of the legal complexity surrounding medical deaths. Either way, the sentence became inseparable from the case itself. Newspapers repeated it constantly. To many members of the public, it sounded dangerously close to a confession without actually being one. The investigation continued expanding as detectives reviewed more deaths connected to Adams. Yet the deeper they looked, the more complicated the situation became. Every suspicious pattern collided with medical uncertainty. Many patients genuinely were elderly and ill. Some likely required strong pain medication. Legitimately. Britain in the 1950s also lacked many modern safeguards governing controlled substances and end-of-life treatment. Standards surrounding morphine administration differed significantly from contemporary expectations. This ambiguity created enormous frustration for investigators. They believed something was deeply wrong, but translating suspicion into courtroom-proof evidence proved far more difficult. Another major obstacle involved time itself. Detectives were examining events stretching back over a decade. Memories faded. Witnesses contradicted each other. Documentation appeared incomplete or altered. Bodies had been buried or cremated years earlier. By the time Scotland Yard fully recognized the possible scale of the allegations against Adams, opportunities for definitive forensic proof had often already disappeared. Yet despite these difficulties, authorities ultimately believed enough evidence existed to move forward. The nation prepared for trial, and by then, the story had grown far beyond Eastbourne itself. Britain became captivated by the image of Dr. John Bodkin Adams, the calm physician accused of turning medicine into murder while hiding behind professional respectability. The investigation had exposed disturbing patterns, but it had not answered the central question. Were investigators uncovering one of the most prolific serial killers in British history, or destroying the reputation of a doctor whose only crime was administering powerful pain relief in a misunderstood era of medicine? That question would soon move from police files into a courtroom watched by the entire country. When the trial of Dr. John Bodkin Adams finally began in 1957, Britain was already emotionally exhausted by the case. For months, Newspapers had transformed the investigation into a national obsession. Every new allegation seemed to deepen public unease. The image at the center of the story was almost impossible to ignore. A respected physician accused of exploiting dying patients while inheriting from their estates. It combined two fears powerful enough to grip the public imagination completely: fear of hidden murder and fear of betrayal by someone trusted absolutely. By the time Adams entered the courtroom, the case had already become known across Britain as the murder trial of the century. The atmosphere surrounding the proceedings felt less like an ordinary criminal trial and more like a national reckoning. Reporters crowded outside the courthouse daily. Headlines speculated endlessly about how many victims Adams may have claimed. Some newspapers portrayed him as a brilliant and manipulative predator who had hidden behind medical authority for years. Others warned against hysteria, insisting the country risked criminalizing doctors for administering pain relief to dying patients. The divide reflected the enormous uncertainty at the heart of the case itself. Because despite the frightening patterns uncovered during the investigation, prosecutors still faced a devastating problem. Suspicion is not proof. And proving murder in a medical context is among the hardest tasks in criminal law. Adams entered the courtroom not as a visibly monstrous figure, but as precisely the kind of man many jurors would have expected a doctor to be. Calm, educated, controlled, respectable. That image mattered enormously. Criminal trials are shaped not only by evidence, but by perception. Adams did not resemble the public's traditional idea of a killer. He was not violent, emotional, or physically intimidating. He was a physician who had spent years treating elderly patients. The defense understood immediately that the prosecution's greatest challenge would be convincing jurors that someone who looked so outwardly civilized could also be capable of calculated murder. Prosecutors focused the case primarily on the death of Edith Alice Morell. According to the Crown's argument, Adams had administered excessive quantities of morphine and heroin-based medication to Morell while gradually positioning himself to benefit financially from her death. They emphasized the heavy sedation she experienced during treatment and the valuable possessions Adams later inherited, including antiques and a Rolls-Royce. The prosecution attempted to build a portrait of systematic manipulation, a doctor controlling medication, isolating vulnerable patients emotionally, then benefiting from their deaths financially. Yet almost immediately, the weaknesses in the case became painfully visible. Edith Morell had suffered a serious stroke and was already gravely ill. This allowed the defense to argue that strong pain medication was medically justified. The prosecution could suggest overmedication, but proving deliberate intent to kill was far more difficult. Every piece of medical evidence existed within a fog of ambiguity. Morphine could relieve suffering. Sedatives could comfort dying patients. Heavy medication in terminal care was not automatically criminal, and the defense leaned heavily into that uncertainty. One of the most important battles inside the courtroom centered on interpretation rather than hard evidence. The prosecution wanted jurors to see patterns of deliberate poisoning hidden beneath medical treatment. The defense wanted jurors to see a doctor attempting to ease suffering in severely ill patients. During an era with different medical standards, the distinction was everything, because under British law, motive alone could not convict Adams. Financial inheritances appeared suspicious, certainly, but suspicion surrounding wills did not prove murder medically. Prosecutors needed to establish that Adams intentionally administered drugs to cause death rather than to relieve pain. That task became extraordinarily difficult without definitive forensic evidence. And forensic evidence, in many cases, no longer existed. Cremation had destroyed crucial opportunities for toxicological examination. Many patients central to the investigation had already been cremated years earlier. The prosecution repeatedly found itself attempting to reconstruct deaths from incomplete records, witness recollections, and circumstantial patterns rather than direct scientific proof. This absence haunted the case. Jurors heard disturbing testimony, but they also heard uncertainty layered over nearly every allegation. Nurses became some of the prosecution's most important witnesses. Several described troubling medical practices surrounding Adams' treatment of patients. Testimony referenced injections administered shortly before decline, unusual levels of sedation, and patient deterioration following treatment. Yet the defense attacked these accounts aggressively. Witness memories, they argued, had become distorted by time, rumor, and media hysteria. Many events had occurred years earlier. Details were unclear. Medical decisions that seemed suspicious in retrospect might have appeared entirely reasonable at the time. The defense strategy proved devastatingly effective because it exploited the central weakness already embedded inside the case: ambiguity. Every suspicious fact carried an alternative explanation. A wealthy patient leaving money to a devoted doctor might reflect manipulation or gratitude. Heavy morphine use might indicate poisoning or compassionate pain relief. Rapid decline after sedation might suggest murder or natural deterioration in elderly patients already close to death. Again and again, certainty slipped away. Adams' defense team also understood something psychologically crucial. Jurors were being asked to criminalize medical judgment itself. That carried enormous emotional consequences. If aggressive pain management could later be interpreted as murder whenever a patient died, doctors across Britain might become fearful of administering necessary medication to suffering patients. The defense leaned into this fear carefully. Adams was portrayed not as a greedy predator, but as a dedicated physician willing to use strong medication to relieve unbearable suffering in dying individuals. In this version of events, he was being punished not for murder, but for compassion misunderstood by investigators and sensationalized by newspapers. The courtroom increasingly became a battleground over the ethics of medicine itself. One of the most historically significant developments emerging from the trial involved the legal principle later associated with the doctrine of double effect. The idea was morally and legally complex. A doctor may administer medication intended to relieve suffering even if that treatment might unintentionally shorten a patient's life. The key distinction lies in intent. If the doctor's primary purpose is pain relief rather than killing, the treatment may remain lawful even when death is accelerated as a side effect. This principle became deeply intertwined with Adams' defense. His lawyers argued that strong medication administered to dying patients reflected legitimate medical care, not homicidal intent. In many ways, the trial exposed a terrifying gray area at the center of medicine. Doctors treating severe pain inevitably possess the ability to shorten life indirectly through powerful drugs. Determining when such treatment crosses into murder is extraordinarily difficult, especially when patients are already seriously ill. Adams' case forced British society to confront that uncertainty publicly for the first time on a massive scale. Outside the courtroom, public fascination only intensified. Newspapers dissected every witness statement. Crowds gathered daily. Some people became convinced Adams was a serial killer who had manipulated the legal system masterfully. Others increasingly believed he was the victim of a moral panic fueled by class resentment, sensational journalism, and misunderstanding of medical practice. Eastbourne itself remained psychologically divided. Some former patients continued defending Adams' character passionately. Others viewed him with growing horror. Yet despite the enormous attention surrounding the case, The prosecution struggled to deliver the one thing jurors often seek most in murder trials: clarity. There was no confession, no indisputable toxicology report proving deliberate overdose, no eyewitness directly observing intentional killing. Instead, there were patterns, suspicions, and unsettling coincidences accumulating around a doctor whose behavior appeared increasingly questionable, but never conclusively murderous. This distinction mattered enormously under criminal law. A defendant cannot legally be convicted because investigators believe he is dangerous or morally suspicious. Guilt must be proven beyond reasonable doubt. And in the Adams case, reasonable doubt existed everywhere. Even the prosecution's own strategic decisions attracted criticism. Many observers believed authorities should have pursued the Gertrude Hullett case instead because she reportedly was not terminally ill before her death. The Morrell prosecution allowed the defense to anchor everything around end-of-life care and pain management. Critics later argued this mistake may have destroyed the possibility of securing a murder conviction. Altogether, after 17 days of proceedings, the trial reached its conclusion. The courtroom waited for the jury's decision under enormous national attention. Then the verdict came. John Botkin Adams was found not guilty of murder. The acquittal sent shockwaves through Britain. Reactions were immediate and deeply divided. Supporters celebrated the outcome as proof that Adams had been falsely accused and unfairly persecuted. Critics saw something very different. To them, the verdict represented a catastrophic failure of justice, not because Adams had necessarily been proven innocent, but because the system had proven incapable of untangling murder from medicine. For many observers, the acquittal did not resolve suspicion. It merely institutionalized uncertainty permanently. Yet although Adams escaped conviction for murder, his legal troubles did not end entirely. Separate proceedings resulted in convictions related to prescription fraud, false cremation paperwork, and violations involving dangerous drugs. These offenses were far less dramatic than murder charges, but they reinforced the perception that serious misconduct had occurred within his medical practice. Authorities eventually removed Adams from the medical register in 1957 and stripped him of prescribing privileges. Officially, the British legal system had rejected the accusation that he was a murderer. It had also concluded he had engaged in deeply improper conduct as a physician. That contradiction became part of the case's enduring mystery. Adams walked free from the most serious allegations, but suspicion followed him permanently. The trial ended without delivering the certainty the public desperately wanted. No definitive answer emerged regarding how many patients may have died naturally, how many may have received questionable treatment, or whether Adams had intentionally killed anyone at all. Instead, the courtroom exposed something more disturbing: the possibility that some crimes may become nearly impossible to prove once they are hidden inside the complexities of medical care. In the years afterward, many investigators remained convinced Adams had escaped justice. Others insisted the prosecution had relied too heavily on suspicion and public emotion rather than hard evidence. The truth became trapped somewhere between those positions, obscured by missing forensic proof, cremated bodies, conflicting testimony, and the ambiguous realities of medicine itself. And as the crowds dispersed from the courthouse and headlines slowly faded from newspapers, one unsettling question remained unanswered across Britain. Had the country just witnessed the acquittal of an innocent doctor or the successful escape of a killer intelligent enough to hide behind the appearance of compassion? When the trial ended and Dr. John Botkin Adams walked out of court acquitted of murder, Britain did not experience relief. There was no sense of emotional closure, no universal acceptance that justice had clearly prevailed. Instead, the case left behind something far more unsettling: uncertainty. The courtroom had answered the legal question, Adams could not be convicted of murder beyond reasonable doubt, but it had failed to answer the moral and psychological question haunting the public from the very beginning. What kind of man had John Botkin Adams truly been? For some people, the verdict confirmed exactly what they already believed. Adams was a devoted physician destroyed by suspicion, media hysteria, and public fear surrounding death and medicine. To supporters, the prosecution had attempted to transform compassionate pain treatment into criminal conduct. They argued that elderly patients naturally died, especially in a retirement town like Eastbourne, and that strong medication was often necessary to relieve suffering. In this interpretation, Adams became a tragic figure, a doctor punished for caring too deeply for dying patients in an era that poorly understood end-of-life medicine. But for others, the acquittal felt deeply wrong. The pattern remained impossible to forget. More than 130 patients reportedly leaving Adams money or gifts. Elderly women heavily sedated shortly before death. Nurses describing unusual injections. Suspicious cremations. Alter records. Missing drugs. Again and again, the same details returned, refusing to disappear simply because a jury had acquitted him. To many investigators and members of the public, Adams did not look like an innocent man cleared by evidence. He looked like a man who had escaped conviction because the crimes themselves were too difficult to prove. That distinction became the defining legacy of the case. Even though Adams avoided a murder conviction, the legal system still concluded serious wrongdoing had occurred. He was convicted of prescription fraud, violations involving dangerous drugs, and issues connected to false cremation paperwork. Authorities removed him from the medical register in 1957, stripping him of the right to prescribe medication. In practical terms, the career that had once made him one of Eastbourne's most respected doctors collapsed permanently. Yet the punishment still appeared strangely incomplete to many observers. A man accused of orchestrating the deaths of vulnerable patients had avoided conviction for the very crimes that defined public fear surrounding him. That contradiction lingered over the rest of his life. Adams himself remained a deeply elusive figure after the trial. He never publicly transformed into the monstrous caricature some newspapers had created during the proceedings. He did not confess. He did not dramatically defend himself through emotional public statements either. Instead, he continued living quietly, almost as though the enormous scandal surrounding his name existed at a distance from him personally. In 1983, he died at the age of 84, still carrying one of the most controversial reputations in British criminal history. And even after his death, the debate surrounding him never truly ended. Historians, criminologists, medical ethicists, and true crime researchers continued returning to the same unresolved questions. Some became convinced Adams had been a serial killer operating under the protection of medical authority. Others argued that retrospective judgment distorted understanding of mid-20th century medical practice. The passage of time only deepened the mystery because the evidence itself remained incomplete and ambiguous. One of the most significant consequences of the Adams case was its influence on legal and medical ethics in Britain. The trial helped shape broader discussion surrounding what later became associated with the doctrine of double effect. This principle recognizes the moral complexity of end-of-life care. A doctor may administer medication intended to relieve severe suffering even if the treatment unintentionally shortens the patient's life. The legality and morality depend on intent. The purpose must be pain relief rather than killing. In many ways, the Adams case forced society to confront this ethical gray area publicly for the first time on a massive scale. Before the trial, such questions often remained confined to hospitals and medical journals. Afterward, they became part of national conversation. How much medication is too much? At what point does easing pain become dangerous? How can the legal system distinguish compassion from homicide when both may involve the same drugs? These questions remain difficult even today. The Adams case exposed how fragile certainty becomes once death enters the medical world. A doctor possesses extraordinary authority over vulnerable people. Patients trust physicians with information they share with no one else. They allow doctors to administer substances capable of relieving pain, inducing unconsciousness, or ending life if misused. Most of society functions because that trust remains intact. The possibility that a doctor could intentionally exploit such trust terrifies people precisely because it threatens something fundamental. Hospitals and clinics are supposed to be places of protection. The Adams case forced Britain to imagine the opposite possibility, that the very environment designed to care for the dying could also conceal violence invisible to ordinary observers. Decades later, another British doctor would bring those fears back into public consciousness with horrifying clarity. Harold Shipman. Shipman, eventually convicted of murdering numerous patients, caused many researchers to revisit the Adams case again. Some historians began referring to Adams as a possible precursor to Shipman, another physician, potentially using medicine as cover for serial killing. The comparison intensified public fascination with Adams because Shipman's later crimes demonstrated that doctors could indeed exploit medical authority to murder repeatedly while avoiding detection. For years, yet important differences remained. Unlike Shipman, Adams was never convicted of murder. His case remained trapped inside uncertainty, which is precisely why it continues haunting criminal history so powerfully. Serial killers are often remembered through certainty, identified victims, proven methods, definitive convictions. Adams occupies a stranger category, a man surrounded by suspicion so overwhelming that many people believe he must have been guilty, yet protected forever by the absence of conclusive proof. This ambiguity transformed him into something more disturbing than a conventional criminal figure. He became a symbol of unresolved doubt itself. Looking back, perhaps the most tragic element of the case lies not in Adams alone, but in the vulnerability of the women at the center of the story. Elderly, isolated, dependent on professional care, many of them lived during a time when questioning doctors felt almost impossible, whether Adams intentionally harmed them or not. The case revealed how vulnerable seriously ill patients can become once they lose independence. Medicine requires trust, but trust also creates opportunity for exploitation when safeguards fail. The women associated with Adams existed within a system that often silenced uncertainty. Nurses hesitated to challenge physicians. Families deferred to medical authority. Elderly patients depended completely on the people treating them. The imbalance of power was enormous. The case also exposed the limitations of justice itself. Criminal law depends heavily on evidence, physical proof, reliable witnesses, clear timelines, scientific certainty. But medicine complicates every one of those categories. Patients die naturally in hospitals and private homes every day. Powerful drugs can both heal and harm. Intent is often invisible. By the time suspicions emerge, forensic opportunities may already be lost forever. The Adams investigation demonstrated how easily uncertainty can overwhelm the legal process when alleged crimes occur within medical treatment itself. Some investigators reportedly remained convinced until the end of their lives that Adams had killed many patients intentionally. Others believe the prosecution allowed fear and pattern recognition to replace hard proof. The truth may now be impossible to fully recover. Too much evidence vanished through cremation, time, and incomplete records. Too many witnesses remembered events imperfectly years later. Too much of the case depended on interpreting motive inside ambiguous medical decisions. Yet perhaps the enduring power of the Adams story comes from something deeper than the unresolved question of guilt. The case forces people to confront uncomfortable realities about trust, aging, illness, and death itself. Most individuals eventually become vulnerable. Most people at some point in life place their survival or comfort in the hands of medical professionals. Society functions because we believe those professionals act ethically. When that trust fractures, even through suspicion alone, the psychological consequences spread far beyond a single courtroom. In the decades since the trial, Eastbourne has changed. Time moved forward. The newspaper headlines disappeared. The houses where Adams visited patients passed into new hands. Many people connected directly to the case died long ago. Yet the story remains strangely alive, continuing to resurface whenever discussions emerge about medical ethics, serial murder, or the dangers hidden within positions of authority. And perhaps that is because the central mystery was never truly solved. Was John Bodkin Adams a compassionate doctor practicing aggressive pain management during a different medical era? Or was he a calculating predator who discovered that murder could hide behind medicine, sedation, and the natural expectations of death? The evidence points in conflicting directions. Some details seem impossible to dismiss innocently. Others remain too uncertain to support definitive conclusions. In the end, the Adams case became more than a murder investigation. It became a mirror reflecting society's deepest anxieties about dependency and trust, about how easily power can hide behind respectability, about whether evil, when it exists, always appears monstrous, or whether sometimes it arrives quietly, carrying a doctor's bag, speaking gently beside a patient's bed while no one realizes danger has already entered the room. And somewhere inside that uncertainty, John Bodkin Adams remains suspended forever, not fully condemned, not fully absolved, but permanently remembered as the doctor who forced Britain to ask whether one of its most trusted professions could also provide the perfect disguise for murder. Long after the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded from newspaper stands, the name John Bodkin Adams continued to linger over Eastbourne like a ghost the town could never fully bury. Time moved on, as it always does. The elderly patients who once sat in quiet seaside homes passed away. Nurses who whispered privately about their fears grew old themselves. Investigators retired. Journalists chased newer scandals. Yet the Adams case refused to disappear completely. It survived because no one could ever answer the central question with certainty. In most criminal cases, society eventually settles into clarity. A killer is convicted, or a suspect is definitively cleared. Evidence creates closure. The Adams case never achieved that. Instead, it remains suspended in an uncomfortable middle ground where suspicion and uncertainty existed side by side. And for decades afterward, that uncertainty continued to disturb people more than a simple verdict ever could. The reason is deeply psychological. Human beings can accept terrible truths more easily than unresolved fear. A convicted murderer becomes understandable in a grim way. An innocent person falsely accused also fits within a recognizable narrative. But Adams belonged to neither category completely. Officially, he was acquitted of murder. Yet unofficially, many people never stopped believing he had killed. Even now, historians and criminologists continue debating whether Britain witnessed one of the 20th century's most prolific undetected serial killers, or one of its most misunderstood physicians. That lingering doubt became the true legacy of the case. Because the Adams story was never only about one doctor. It was about the terrifying possibility that ordinary systems of trust can conceal extraordinary harm. Doctors occupy a uniquely intimate role in human life. Patients allow them access to the body, to pain, to fear, and ultimately to death itself. Few professions possess such extraordinary authority. Most people never question that authority because society depends upon it functioning honestly. Without trust, medicine collapses into fear. Adams forced Britain to confront what happens when that trust becomes uncertain. Even the physical nature of the alleged crimes intensified the horror surrounding the case. Violence hidden within medicine does not resemble conventional murder. There are no broken doors, no screams heard by neighbors, no obvious bloodstains. Instead, there is sedation, drowsiness, quiet rooms, a patient drifting gradually into unconsciousness while the people nearby assume they are witnessing. Natural decline. If Adams truly was guilty, investigators believed he understood something profoundly disturbing. That death itself can become almost invisible when it arrives inside a medical setting, especially among the elderly, especially among the terminally ill, especially when the person controlling the medication is also the person trusted to explain the death afterward. That realization permanently altered how many people viewed the case. Before Adams, the public image of serial murder often centered around obvious brutality. After Adams, another possibility emerged that intelligence, respectability, and professional authority might provide a far safer disguise for killing than violence ever could. This idea became even more chilling decades later when Britain confronted the crimes of Harold Shipman. Shipman, also a physician, was eventually proven to have murdered numerous patients under his care. His conviction caused many researchers to re-examine Adams with renewed suspicion. Comparisons between the two men appeared frequently. Both operated within medicine. Both treated vulnerable patients. Both worked in environments where death was expected and therefore less likely to trigger immediate alarm. Yet there remained one enormous difference between them. Shipman's guilt was conclusively established. Adams never was. And perhaps that difference is precisely why the Adams case remains psychologically haunting in a way even other notorious crimes are not. It exists permanently inside uncertainty. There is another reason the case continues to resonate decades later. It exposed how vulnerable elderly people can become within systems meant to protect them. Many of Adams' patients were women living alone, dependent on caretakers and physicians for support. Age, illness, and isolation created circumstances where independent judgment became increasingly difficult. Some were heavily medicated. Some were emotionally reliant on the doctor visiting them regularly. Some had few relatives nearby capable of questioning treatment decisions. Whether Adams intentionally exploited those vulnerabilities or not, the case revealed how easily power can concentrate around a single trusted figure. The women connected to the investigation often disappear beneath the larger mythology surrounding Adams himself, but they remain the emotional center of the story. Edith Alice Morell, lying bedridden after a stroke. Gertrude Hullett, struggling with depression while receiving powerful sedatives. Clara Neal Miller, under heavy medication, while nurses watched uneasily from the edges of the room. These women were not merely names inside legal documents. They were people navigating fear, illness, aging, and dependency during the final chapters of their lives. And in those final chapters, they placed extraordinary trust in one man. That human vulnerability gives the case its enduring emotional weight. Because the story forces listeners to imagine themselves, or the people they love, inside those same rooms, dependent on a physician, unable to fully evaluate treatment decisions. Hoping the person standing beside the bed is motivated entirely by compassion. Most of society functions because we assume that trust is justified. The Adams case challenged that assumption in a way few other crimes ever have. It also revealed the limitations of criminal justice when medicine enters the equation. Courts depend heavily on certainty. They rely on physical evidence, clear motives, and direct causal links between action and death. But medicine complicates all of those categories simultaneously. drugs capable of healing can also kill. Patients already near death blur the line between natural decline and deliberate harm. Intent exists invisibly inside the mind of the person administering treatment. And once bodies are cremated, scientific certainty may disappear forever. The Adams trial demonstrated that the legal system struggles profoundly when asked to separate compassion from homicide within end-of-life care. Even today, decades after the trial, debates surrounding palliative medicine continue touching similar ethical questions. How aggressively should pain be treated in dying patients? At what point does sedation become dangerous? Can shortening suffering unintentionally shorten life as well? These are not abstract legal questions. They are real dilemmas faced by doctors and families every day. The Adams case became one of the earliest public examples forcing society to confront those moral ambiguities directly. Yet beyond ethics and law, there remains something deeply unsettling about Adams personally. Not because his guilt was proven, but because of how ordinary he appeared. Many serial killers throughout history become mythologized through obvious monstrosity. Adams never fit that image. He was polite, religious, professional, soft-spoken, the kind of man people expected to trust automatically. That contradiction disturbed the public more than open brutality might have. If evil can exist behind such a calm and respectable face, then appearances themselves become unreliable. Perhaps that is why the most famous line associated with Adams still echoes decades later. When asked whether he intentionally killed patients, he reportedly responded, "I don't think you can prove it was murder." The sentence endures because it captures the entire unresolved nature of the case in a single moment. Was it arrogance? Was it confidence in legal ambiguity? Was it an indirect confession hidden inside careful wording? No one truly knows. But the statement survived because it reflected a frightening truth investigators eventually discovered themselves. Proving murder inside medicine can become nearly impossible once uncertainty takes hold. And so the story ends where it began, in Eastbourne beside the sea, among quiet homes where elderly residents once trusted their doctor completely. The town itself no longer resembles the Eastbourne of the 1950s. Time erased much of the physical world connected to the case. Yet the questions remain alive. Did John Bodkin Adams spend years compassionately easing the suffering of dying patients while enduring false suspicion from an anxious public? Or did he discover that medicine offered the perfect cover for murder, a place where death could be explained away naturally, where victims were vulnerable, and where trust itself became a weapon? There may never be a final answer. Too much evidence vanished. Too many years passed. Too many deaths occur behind closed doors where only doctor and patient truly knew what happened. But perhaps that uncertainty is what transformed the Adams case from a historical crime into something closer to a permanent warning. A warning about the dangers hidden inside unchecked authority, about the fragility of trust, about how easily respectability can conceal darker motives, and about the terrifying possibility that sometimes the people society fears least may possess the greatest power to harm. In the end, John Bodkin Adams was never fully condemned and never fully cleared. He remained suspended somewhere between healer and killer, compassion and greed, innocence and guilt. And that unresolved shadow, more than any verdict ever delivered in court, is what ensured his story would never truly die.